So I want to talk about, the title is Consciousness Non-Local. And first of all, let me say by non-local, I don't believe you have to go outside space and time or extra dimensions, and I'll come to that. However, to understand non-local consciousness, so let's ask the question, what is consciousness in the brain, and then we'll worry about consciousness out of the brain. And we take it for granted that when we open our eyes, the world out there appears inside our head with a being. Being is meant to imply conscious experience, having a phenomenal subjective experience. That means consciousness. And the question is approached by neuroscientists who probe the brain, artificial intelligence, robotics people, artists who try to capture the essence of conscious experience, physicists testing reality, Schrodinger's cat, psychiatrists like Freud, anesthesiologists who look suspiciously like me, and that's what I do for my day job, meditators, and philosophers, and many others. This is the kind of crowd we bring together at the Tucson conferences, the science of consciousness, all different approaches. Now, let's divide it basically into two general camps and ask the question, which came first, consciousness or life? And the main camp would be neuroscience, psychology, most Western philosophy, that life came first and gave rise to consciousness. Consciousness emerged as a property of living systems, although there's no evidence for that. This idea is that consciousness emerged from living systems. It requires consciousness to be epiphenomenal because it comes too late for conscious action. The activity in our brain processing what somebody hears happens after we've already responded, seemingly consciousness. So the party line in mainstream Western science is that consciousness is epiphenomenal and illusion. We don't really know what's out there. For example, going to the origin of Western philosophy, Plato said the world out there is all in our head. A representation, being is all in our head. So it's not necessarily what's out there, it's what's in our head that we know. And Plato reviewed the same problem with Plato's cave, and he had this allegory of prisoners who could only see two-dimensional projections on the cave wall. And for them, that was reality. For them, 2 dimensions was all there was. They never realized that there were 3 dimensions. And some people say, well, we have more, there's more out there than we can perceive, maybe more than our 3 or 4 dimensions. Not necessarily extra dimensions, but we only have a glimmer of what's really out there is the point. Now, Descartes realized this also, and he said, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. Meaning the only thing of which he could be certain was that he was conscious. And as an example of that, he came up with his story of a brain in a vat that was fed information by an evil genius. And in this case, the brain is thinking, Bing, I'm walking outside in the sun. Because that's the information being fed into it. And movies like The Matrix and other stories like that suggest that we don't really know what's out there. And we could be in some kind of simulation or what have you. This is Western science approach. Leading to the conundrum that both consciousness and reality may both be illusion, which is an unfortunate predicament. Now, on the other hand, the alternative view would include panpsychism, Eastern philosophy, spirituality, Whitehead, Alfred North Whitehead, and quantum approaches, which is the path I would take, which says that consciousness is intrinsic to the universe. It preceded life, it was there before life, it actually may have prompted the origin and evolution of life. Rather than survival, I think life has evolved and originated to access feelings and emotions intrinsic to the universe. I talked about this the other day. And may persist after life. If it was there before life, life as a whole, it may persist after individual life. If it's intrinsic to the universe, why wouldn't it? So in Eastern philosophy, consciousness pervades a deeper level of reality. Being is everywhere. We're like a wave in a big ocean of feelings and emotions of things. Now, let's go back to the Western approach, modern science. It looks at the brain like a computer. So here we have a network of neurons. These are actual neurons connected by synapses. And people have likened that to a computer matrix, which are nodes and switches in a computer. And you put input in, you get output out, and they say the output is consciousness. But there are many, many problems with this view. If you map neurons even with simple Warm nervous systems that we know, we don't get behavior, it comes too late, it's epiphenomenal, there's all kinds of problems with it. Nonetheless, this is the party line. This is the conventional view in modern science. And in modern science, kind of like Plato, information comes into the thalamus, for example, visual input to the thalamus, or any type of input, and in the case of vision, it's projected in 3 waves before it gets conscious. And this is what takes time. It takes 300 milliseconds, and by the time that happens, we've already responded, suggesting that consciousness is an illusion. So it goes to the back of the brain, which is not conscious, then it goes to the front of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, and then the third wave goes to various places, and we know from various types of experiments, it's the third wave that is conscious. For example, the third wave, and only the third wave, is erased by all anesthetics, all different types of anesthetics. So we put a patient to sleep, and that's what I do as my day job. This activity, we can measure visually both potential effect. We do that to make sure certain the spinal cord or cranial nerves and whatnot are intact, or somatosensory. And the forward feed forward network is intact. The feedback, the third wave, is erased. And why that is, nobody knows, because the neurotransmitters, the neurons, and everything are the same. The third wave is something different about it. We don't know what that is. Once we get to the cortex, let me go back. So once we get to the third wave of the cortex, there's also three waves, it seems. So here, if the thalamic inputs are coming from elsewhere, they go to layers, layer 4, and then from layer 4 they go to layer 1, 2, 3, and 6. And from then they converge on layer 5, these giant pyramid-shaped neurons called the giant pyramidal cells of layer 5, whose apical dendrites go to the surface and give rise to EEG. So if you're measuring EEG, it's coming mostly from these apical dendrites moving up to the surface. And then the axons go down, subcortical outputs to make you move your arm or say a word and so forth. So it seems that these pyramidal neurons are where Bing is happening. They may certainly happen elsewhere, but if you had to pick one place and bet on one type of neuron, one place in the brain, it would be these giant pyramidal cells in layer 5. So is that the answer? No, that's not the answer, because they're single neurons. They're still relying on connections, and we know that single cell organisms can do all kinds of interesting things without any connections at all. So we know that single cell organisms use these structures called microtubules, which are inside pyramidal cells, inside all cells, especially neurons, which are in a unique arrangement of mixed polarity networks. They're broken up. These are supposed to be part of the cytoskeleton, but if you want a skeletal support in your body, your bones, for example, you wouldn't break them in half and have them interrupted. Yet these are interrupted in a mixed polarity, which gives rise to resonances and interesting vibrations. I'll come back to that point. So it looks like Bing is happening for reasons I don't have time to go into fully here in the dendrites and soma of layer 5 pyramidal cells, where the information is integrated to a threshold and then firing occurs. So the integration to a threshold and consciousness may be the same thing. And the firings that people talk about, the output may be the messenger, conveying the message of consciousness somewhere else to move your arm. A lot of people, however, think that the firings or the spikes mediate consciousness. But I think that consciousness has already happened. That's a whole other topic of debate. But I would bet on dendritic somatic microtubule processes inside pyramidal cells as the most likely place for consciousness, although it can happen elsewhere. So I got interested in these microtubules 40-some years ago when I was in medical school studying cancer, because when cells divide, the mitotic spindles and centrioles are made of microtubules, and they have to precisely divide and separate the chromosomes, or else you get abnormal genotypes, which can lead to cancer. Everybody else in the lab went into the genes, genetic revolution, but I stayed fixated on microtubules because I thought they might be processing information like a computer. Computers were new to me back then in the early 70s, and these looked like Boolean switching matrices, and so I began to publish models of microtubules as information processing beginning in 1982. And then I wrote a book on it in 1987 and worked with some physicists later on, modeling them as molecular automata. And then one day, I'll come back to that. Then one day somebody said to me, let's say there's all this information processing going on at a deeper level. many orders of magnitude more information that's happening at the level of neurons. And how would that explain consciousness? Feelings, love, joy, emotion, pain. Became known as the heart problem later. And I didn't have a good answer. Fortunately, that person suggested I read a book by Sir Roger Penrose called The Emperor's New Mind, where he attacked the idea that consciousness was a computation, and that for understanding and consciousness, there was something to do with quantum physics that must be involved. And I read that book, I was kind of blown away by it. I didn't know that much about quantum physics, and I think it's fair to say that maybe not too many people today really understand quantum physics. I think Roger Penrose is at the top of that list of understanding it. But he put forth a mechanism for consciousness, but he needed a quantum computer. I had a structure that could be a quantum computer, but didn't have a mechanism. So we teamed up, and we developed a theory called orchestrated objective deduction, which came out in 95, 96, was severely criticized, but I think it's fair to say now that we've got a lot of evidence on our side and are gaining momentum, and it has some pretty profound implications. Now, one of which, I'll get back to the non-locality in a minute, is that microtubules are very important for a lot of reasons, and when they fall apart, when they become unstable, you get Alzheimer's disease. Now, there's two types of lesions in Alzheimer's. There's amyloid plaques outside the neurons, and then there's these neurofibrillary tangles inside the neurons. And these proteins are called tau proteins, and they bind to certain places on the microtubule and stabilize it, and also serve as kind of a traffic signal to tell the motor proteins where to deliver their cargo for synaptic plasticity. And in Alzheimer's disease, the microtubules disintegrate, the tau falls off, it gets hyperphosphorylated, and goes over the corner of the neuron. The microtubules fall apart, the neuron gets all crinkly and misshapen, and you get cognitive dysfunction. You lose memory, you lose the ability to think and to perform cognition, and eventually consciousness. And obviously Alzheimer's is a huge, huge problem. Now, most of the money and attention goes to amyloid plaques outside the neuron, and the amyloid plaques are related to these lesions inside the neuron, but most evidence points to the fact that the destructive problems come from disintegration of microtubules and neurofibrillary tangles. The same thing happens in something called postoperative cognitive dysfunction, POCD, which is a problem in anesthesia. If very young people, babies, and very old people get too many anesthetics, they get this Alzheimer's-like picture, and we know that it's because the tau falls off, and they get spilled tau in the spinal fluid, and the microtubules disintegrate. So it's a problem in anesthesia, it's a problem in Down syndrome dementia, it's a problem in Alzheimer's and other forms of dementia. So in memory, let's just talk about memory for a second. Most views of memory are that it's due to synaptic plasticity, the sensitivity of synaptic proteins, but the problem is these proteins last hours to days, and yet memories can last lifetimes. So if the memory restored in the sensitivity of this synapse and many, many other synapses in a network, it wouldn't explain, these are recycled by the microtubules and other structures, and yet memories can last lifetimes. So there must be something at a deeper level. So one thing that happens in memory, in long-term potentiation, which is a model for memory, is that calcium comes in and activates this enzyme called CANK2, calcium calmodulin kinase 2, which then gloms onto microtubules and goes around the neuron and phosphorylates something by adding energy by a phosphate bond, which essentially encodes memory information. So when I learned about this, I said, I wonder what they're glomming onto, or if they could be encoding the memory in microtubules. It's a hexagonal molecule. And so I got with my friends, my colleagues Travis Krennick and Jack Tusinski to model interactions between CANK2 and microtubules. And CANK2 is a beautiful snowflake-shaped molecule. This is actually before it's activated. If you look at it on the side, it looks like this. Look at the top, it looks like this. When calcium comes into the neuron, it activates it, and these 6 legs or arms or kinase domains sprout out, becomes like this little nanomachine with the phosphorylation sites here, which can encode memory. So we wanted to know if this might be binding and encoding memory in microtubules. So here's a paper we published in 2012, where here's the CANK2 and here's the microtubule lattice, 2 types of microtubule lattices. And we discovered or showed that the geometry and the size scale is precisely perfect for binding onto microtubule lattices, even with the B lattice. And so we came up with this model that the CAM-K2 literally lands on the microtubule, and each of the 6 kinase domains can impart memory, can encode 1 bit of information. So this would be 6 bits of information, or a byte of information, per CAM-K2. And you have thousands of these coming in with each synaptic event. So we think this is a very robust mechanism for encoding memory inside the neuron that would then be hardwired by a biochemical mechanism to last a long time. Now, this is also similar to the structure of language. Noam Chomsky is famous for, he's a famous linguist and a very famous intellectual who's argued for many, many years that language has some structure inside the brain somewhere. And various people have come up with this structure of language as a branching hierarchical structure called XBAR. So that the subject or the key word in a sentence would be at the top, and then it branches off, and you can construct sentences and language out of this type of XBAR structure. So you start with something small like a phoneme and go to a tone, a word, a phrase, a sentence. And that hierarchical structure actually matches up with EEG. Anyway, when I heard about this from my friends Massimo Pietro-Palmerini, Italian obviously, and David Medeiros, who worked with Chomsky, I said, those look like the patterns in the microtubules. And they became very interested in that, and Chomsky's been looking for a structure of language for many years, and so they put me in touch with him, and actually we met a few months ago, and we're working on this project together, along with these guys, to develop a structural model for language based on XBAR type structures in microtubules. Now, another aspect of microtubules that may be relevant and interesting is that the hexagonal lattice of the microtubule shown here matches up with the I Ching. The I Ching in Chinese culture is basically 6 bits of information. And so there's 64 possible arrangements of those 6 bits. And that's exactly what we get. And this was a poster presented at the Tucson conference by Ethan Yang and Owen Chen, where here we have the microtubule hexagonal patterns, the 64 possibilities for the 6, and the same correlate with the I Ching. So this is kind of a language, or maybe a Rosetta Stone, who knows, because we don't understand the origin of the I Ching, and it leads to archetypes and things like that. So it's a suggestion that the I Ching may be reflecting something biological and something having to do with deeper meaning and archetypes and things of that nature. Okay, so let's just think about the brain as a whole. By conventional mechanisms, by synapses, has 10 to the 11th neurons, 1,000 synapses per neuron, operating at about 100 hertz, gives you 10 to the 16th operations per second per brain. So the AI singularity people will say, well, when we get to 10 to the 16th operations per second in a computer, we'll have brain equivalents. You'll be able to download your consciousness into a computer, give us another $100 million and we'll have it, and you can be immortal. Well, I think that's baloney. However, if you go deep inside the neuron, look at the microtubules, you get 10 to the 11th neurons, 10 to the 9th tubulins per neuron, oscillating much faster at about 10 megahertz, which gives you 10 to the 16th operations per second per neuron, the same as these guys are suggesting in the whole brain, and 10 to the 27th per second for the whole brain. Well, I was going around talking about this to AI meetings and neural net meetings, and I wasn't very popular because I was making their job much more difficult, pushing the goalposts way, way downstream. And also Roger Penrose was at the time criticizing them for others. But as I said before, where's consciousness? Where's the being? Is something else required? For example, quantum physics. So this is when I read Roger's book, The Emperor's New Mind. And quantum physics is a difficult topic, so let me give you a simple version. It's kind of like the yin yang, in that reality is divided into 2 phases, quantum and classical. The classical world that we exist in, that we are used to, everything is predictable, dynamic, governed by the laws of gravity, Newton's laws, the gas laws, electromagnetism, and so forth. But at small scales, and we don't know exactly how small, everything gets different. Things can be in superposition of multiple states or locations at the same time. Things can be separated yet still connected. They can condense into unitary objects. The rules change at the small scale, but we don't really know the cutoff or why that happens. We don't see this type of weird quantum behavior in our perceived world. So as I said, in the quantum world, quantum superposition, multiple locations, non-local, things can be connected over space and time, wave-like and small, and in the classical world, localized, particle-like, and large. Now, it turns out that consciousness, represented here by Bing, appears to be on the edge between the quantum and classical worlds. And somebody pointed out to me the Kabbalah has something like this. The Kabbalah describes two worlds, a world of beauty and a world of strife, and that consciousness, it says in the Kabbalah, dances on the edge between the two worlds. And I think that's true. The consciousness is the boundary between the quantum and classical world. Now, how does that work? Well, we can ask the question by asking, why don't we see quantum superpositions in our perceived world? I assume you see one of me, you see one slide, I see one of you. We're not smeared out by waves. So why is that? This is a very long story going back over 100 years. It's called the measurement problem in quantum mechanics. And one way, and Schrödinger wanted to show how absurd this problem was and how absurd the situation was. So he came up with this thought experiment where a quantum particle outside this box, like a photon being in two different polarization states or two different spins at the same time, one of which would enter the box, trigger the poison, and kill the cat. The other one would continue on. Now, but we don't observe this. We see only one or the other. So the first solution to the problem put forth by Niels Bohr, Eugene Wigner, von Neumann, staff, more recently David Chalmers and Kelvin McQueen, was that consciousness causes collapse of the wave function. So according to this, if it were possible to amplify the quantum system into a dead cat and a live cat, the cat would be both dead and alive until somebody opened the box, and at that instant, and only at that instant, the cat was either dead or alive. Now this allowed Bohr to do experiments and allowed quantum mechanics to flourish and become extremely successful. But it puts consciousness outside science. It puts consciousness as some weird extraneous thing that we don't understand and we're not even trying to understand or explain to bring in and solve a problem, collapse of the wave function. It's kind of dualist. It puts consciousness outside of science. If you're dualist, that's okay, but it's not really science. Now there's some other possibility, and this is some experiments that Dean Reagan at IONS has been doing, the double slit experiment, where he has people observing whether the wave, whether the particle behaves like a particle or a wave, whether you see interference patterns or not. And he's been doing it over the internet. He gave a great talk about this in Tucson recently. Another possibility is decoherence, that any interaction between a quantum superposition and the classical environment disrupts the quantum state. So according to this, any quantum system will run into the environment and will degrade and lose its coherence. But this is unsatisfactory because the quantum states don't really go away. They just kind of get buried in noise. And how can any quantum state be truly isolated? Somebody criticized our theory based on this argument, and I showed the paper to Roger Penrose, and he said, according to this, quantum states are just impossible, so this can't be right. So this is kind of a stopgap measure that needs to be replaced, I think. A third possibility is the multiple worlds, in which in a superposition we have two possibilities. Each possibility evolves its own universe. So it starts off by saying superpositions are separations in reality. Reality is split. So if this clicker were in two positions, one would go off and form its own universe, and some of us anyway would go with it and observe it, and some would go the other and observe it over there. So this works mathematically and is very popular among physicists. It's kind of cool. Well, there's this infinite number of universes, but it's really a bunch of hogwash. There's no evidence for it. It can't be proven. It can't be testable. It's kind of a silly way to get out of facing reality of what's really going on. Nonetheless, it's a very popular explanation. Finally, and there's some others, but the main one I want to talk about now is Roger Penrose's idea that consciousness, that self-collapse, that the wave function collapses on its own, and when it does so, it causes consciousness, it generates consciousness. So remember the Copenhagen interpretation, the first one, where consciousness causes collapse. In this case, consciousness is collapse, or collapse is consciousness. To do so, Roger addressed the perplexing question, how could something possibly be in two places or states at the same time? That's really a mystery that everybody else just ignored and went on to try to work around it. He did so by connecting quantum mechanics to general relativity. So imagine, let's take four-dimensional space-time and be able to draw it on a piece of paper or a screen, take 3 dimensions of space down to 1 dimension of space, 1 dimension of time. From general relativity, Einstein's general relativity, we know that a particle is a curvature, is equivalent to curvature in space-time. So originally he said it for, the example was the sun curving light from a distant star around the sun. And Arthur Eddington went up on a mountaintop during the eclipse and was able to see a star behind the sun curving around it, proving the curvature of space-time. Which also proved that there is something to space-time. The universe is not a void with particles buzzing around. It's actually a fabric, a metric, going back to the Greek idea of a planet, of some kind of curvature. So if you imagine this particle oscillating back and forth, it'd be the curvature oscillating back and forth. So what about superposition? Well, in superposition, we have a curvature over here and a curvature over here. We have a particle here and here. So according to Roger's idea, in this cartoon-like version, superposition is a separation in the fabric of the universe, in the very structure of space-time geometry. So the universe itself is actually beginning to shred, to come apart. Now, if this were to continue, this would be the multiple worlds. Remember I said before that in multiple worlds, each possibility evolves its own universe. So here's universe 1, here's universe 2, because the separations just continue on their own. Now, Roger came up with an alternative explanation that I think is the best that I've heard, anyway, because it links general relativity and quantum mechanics, explains consciousness, and solves the measurement problem in one fell swoop. Basically, he said these superpositions, so here's a separation in space-time geometry, are unstable and will self-collapse or will undergo quantum state reductions at an objective threshold, therefore objective reduction, OR, at a time t equals h over e sub g. This is basically the uncertainty principle, the most common, or indeterminacy principle in quantum mechanics. So the separations continue, but at this time t, which is equal to h over g, e sub g, one will cease to exist and one will continue, and this becomes the one that is chosen. And here's the kicker. When that happens, there's a moment of consciousness that occurs. That this self-collapse by this simple equation causes a moment of consciousness. Bing occurs right there whenever t equals h over h over e sub g. So we could imagine that these are feelings, and this feeling, since this is consciousness, that this feeling over here is a smiley face, it feels good, and maybe this one is a frowny face. The point I'm trying to make is that feelings and emotions are intrinsic to the universe, like mass, spin, or charge, and that consciousness is intrinsic and built into the universe at the nitty-gritty level, being a fundamental level of space-time. Now, why would, the other thing he said several other things, including the fact that these selections are not random. So it's not a flip the coin as it is in other types of decoherence, for example, or the observer effect, but are influenced by Platonic values in the structure of space-time geometry. That there's something built into this, perhaps a resonance, that will cause the system to tend to pick the pleasurable or the good or the positive emotion or feeling or outcome. And he said these are influenced by Platonic values in the structure of space-time geometry. And I think this is similar, comparable to what Irvin talks about with the Akashic Record, Telarca Shurdan, the Noosphere, the Way of the Tao, Jungian, collective unconscious, perhaps other ideas. That the collapse can be influenced by factors intrinsic to the universe, perhaps by resonating with the structure of the universe. And what the structure of the universe looks like, nobody knows for sure, but this is the best bet. This is a twister. And Roger Penrose actually has developed most of the main models for the structure of space-time geometry going back to the 50s. Spin networks, spinners, quantum geometry, and twisters, which are these kind of flowering toruses with a twist. They're really amazing structures, and I'm trying to wrap my head around that. But this is the best bet for what the structure of the universe looks like. And you can imagine that these might also begin to separate and have little collapses on their edges, and also that there might be information embedded there so that to resonate to the collapse, that the platonic values, the Akashic record might be encoded in this type of structure, which is everywhere. It's everywhere in the universe. Now, this has been criticized a lot, but it remains the only mechanism for conscious experience ever proposed. Most theorists, other theorists will say, well, you have a bunch of computation, it gets complicated enough, and consciousness emerges at some magical number without specifying why or when or what that number might be. This puts consciousness at the most basic level of the universe. These types of collapses are happening everywhere, in the floor, in the air molecules, all around us, kind of like what decoherence would be. But normally, if they're happening in the screen, in the clicker, in the air, they're in random polar environments and would be isolated, not connected. It's kind of like panpsychism, except it's an event, more like Whitehead. Lacking meaning and context. We call these proto-conscious. In our recent papers, Roger and I call these types of events proto-conscious because they lack meaning. And as a metaphor, I think of these proto-conscious moments like the sounds of an orchestra warming up. If you go to the symphony and you sit down and they're warming up and the violin, they're all doing and they're all making individual sounds and tones, it's not music. It's these random notes and tones. And then the orchestra begins to play and you have a symphony or you have a rock and roll classic or whatever. So the difference between these proto-conscious events and consciousness is like the difference between sounds, between basically noise and music. And I think music is a much better analogy or metaphor or explanation for consciousness than is computation. And in a recent paper I suggested that life and the brain evolved, actually originated and evolved to orchestrate consciousness as music of the universe. And I think there's a lot of cultural history to that, the spheres and so forth. But I think consciousness is more like music, and I've written some stuff about that. So anyway, Roger had a mechanism for consciousness as a quantum process, but he didn't have a candidate for a quantum computer in the brain. At that point, I thought, Microtubules might be his quantum computer, and his objective reduction might be the mechanism I needed. So we teamed up and invited to the first Tucson conference in 1994, after which we went to the Grand Canyon. There's Ryder, there's his lovely wife Vanessa, there's me about to fall in. That's David Chalmers, in case famous philosopher, and some other people. And we began to develop our theory called orchestrated objective reduction, Orch OR. And basically, without taking the time to go into it, the idea is that we have in a microtubule, the brain would be the superposition, which reached this threshold. Now I'm showing you one piece of one microtubule, but you would have billions of these tubulins, individual subunits, throughout the brain. And this connects or correlates with a process in the fundamental level of the universe, a separation and then collapse of in space-time geometry within each of these and being. So it makes a connection between the brain and the fine-scale structure of the universe.
Stuart, what do you call it? Orchestrated?
Orchestrated objective reduction. Orch OR. OR is Roger's mechanism for collapse, and then orchestrated means we take all the individual ones and turn them into music, a symphony, through resonance, through memory, through input. So that's what the microtubules in the brain do.
Stuart, and the orchestrated is also driven perhaps by the Tao or collective unconscious Akashic field.
We're coming to that. We're coming to that. So consciousness would then be a sequence of discrete events, a stream of consciousness. We know that the consciousness seems to be, William James actually described both possibilities, species present, which is a specific moment, and a stream of consciousness. And you can think of these as specific moments occurring in this case at 25 hertz, 25 milliseconds, 40 hertz, gamma synchrony, and sending quantum information backward in time, which is another story I don't have time for. So how would this quantum stuff happen inside the microtubule? If we look inside one of these proteins, tubulin, we see a lot of these phenyl rings which give rise to which have pi resonance clouds and quantum dipole oscillations. And the red spheres are where anesthesia works, and it turns out that anesthesia works in the microtubules. It's been generally assumed they act on membrane proteins, but the latest results seem to show that they work in microtubules. So our model basically is the idea that if you align several of these, you get dipoles, quantum dipoles that can oscillate back and forth. You have quantum superposition of both, and that gives rise to the quantum superpositions which accumulate to give you E sub G. So if we kind of scale back, we can see here's our neuron. You have a bunch of neurons that have a whole brain. Look at one microtubule. You look at one trio of these tubulin dipoles, and then we zoom in on the dipoles themselves, which are oscillating and go into superposition. And anesthesia, it turns out, blocks these dampens these dipole oscillations. Kranaczynski and I have a paper out and another one coming out soon showing how anesthesia acts to dampen these dipoles in these pi resonance clouds. There's actually evidence for this, and this comes from the work of Anirban Bhattacharya, who looked at individual neurons with 6 nanoprobes, and then looked at individual microtubule, and then rows of individual tubulins. And I won't go into the details of this, except he applied, microtubules are good insulators, but when you stimulate them at certain combinations of alternating current, they become highly conductive, superconductive, probably quantum. And depending on the level, if you look at a fairly large scale, like neurons, you get megahertz, kilohertz, and hertz. And we think that hertz, EEG, is actually beat frequencies of faster vibrations. If you go down the level of microtubules, you get gigahertz, megahertz, and kilohertz. And you go even smaller, you get down to terahertz, which is infrared, gigahertz, and megahertz. So this is evidence from Anirban's work. And interestingly, each of these resonance peaks is a triplet. And if you look inside, you see another triplet. So Anirban talks about triplets of triplets, and at different octaves. So I'll explain what this is. So Anirban took those vibrations and compressed them down into audio so we could hear them. So this is basically the sound of microtubules inside neurons going faster frequencies. It's kind of cool, and actually a musician I know has taken this and used it in some songs. But that repeating resonant frequency is actually slowed down versions of what's happening inside neurons and inside microtubules. All right, I'll move on. So to put it in perspective, to get back to the topic of this session, of this theme, if we look at what I showed you before and then look at the frequencies, so we're going to start at the very, very fast, 10 to the 12th, where these high resonance oscillations, this is actually infrared. And then we get to the level of individual tubulin, we're down to, so this is terahertz, then we get to gigahertz, megahertz, kilohertz, hertz, and EEG. And as I said, Roger and I suggested that EEG, which although it's been used for 100 years in medicine, we still don't understand its origin. I'd be eager to hear what Evan and Alexander thought about this, but even though we know that some of them come from this circuit and some from that, the whole thing put together still doesn't make sense. So we think it's one dynamical, fractal hierarchical dynamic vibrational system when you have beat frequencies, for example, individual microtubules that are closely tuned but not quite, will give beats that give rise to EEG. So we think it's all part of one system. So let me back up. Let's. Pardon me?
What was the beat frequency? You're picking up in the EEG?
The beat frequency, which is slow, which is like, so if you have two musical instruments, like two guitars that are slightly out of tune, they're playing the same note, but one's just a little bit off, you're going to get a beat at half the frequency difference between the two. So we think that the megahertz vibrations of the microtubules, because they're opposite aligned, one might be 10.0001, megahertz and one might be 10.0000. They're going to interfere and give a much slower beat frequency down in the EEG range, down there.
That's what they picked up as the EEG.
That's, yeah, we think that's, and that gets amplified by memory proteins, and we see it as EEG. Now, what happens if we go faster out here? Let's say the patient suffers a cardiac arrest, as we heard about from Kim. And the blood stops flowing, oxygen isn't being delivered, the microtubules are stressed, are under distress, the membranes go silent. These quantum vibrations could go deeper this way, off the screen, and go faster, deeper into the structure of the universe. Because we're really going up in size scale, and as we go this way, we're going down in size scale, smaller and smaller and smaller. So here we're already at the level of electrons. If we keep going, we're going to get smaller and smaller into pure space-time geometry itself, like the curvatures and the oscillations of the curvatures that I showed previously. So it's possible that in a near-death situation, or death for that matter, that the oscillations continue independent of the biology and move this way and continue to oscillate in space-time geometry without any biology. You don't need the biology. I mean, even when it's in the brain, it's happening at the level of space-time geometry. So, because there's plenty of energy when you get out here, you don't need blood, oxygen, or glucose or anything like that. So you can have oscillations, they continue, but it might, the quantum information wouldn't necessarily dissipate, but stay entangled as something like a quantum soul. And I've written a paper with Deepak Chopra suggesting that the quantum soul in near-death and out-of-body experiences can go to different levels of the universe. For example, here. So this is actually from a book by Brian Greene on string theory, and I don't subscribe to string theory, but the idea is that you start at the top, large scale, and imagine going down 3 or 4 orders of magnitude with each level and expanding each little square, and eventually you get to the Planck scale where you have the bottom of the universe, the basement floor, where you have information. So it could be that as consciousness leaves the body, or even under certain circumstances, you go down a deeper level, and Bing, because of ECG, gets larger and more intense. So these out-of-body experiences, near-death experiences, maybe even afterlife, would be more intense. They'd be more intense, have a great, and would be different for various reasons in terms of logic, kind of like what Ray was talking about, but greater intensity. And these levels could be what Deepak calls lokas or astral planes, and consciousness could go to these levels, and then if the patient's revived, go back into the microtubules. If the patient's not revived, well, who knows? Maybe exist independently as a quantum soul, or go into another set of microtubules somewhere. So this raises the question of out-of-body experiences, as I mentioned, and the white light. And let me just mention end-of-life brain activity. In anesthesia, we use these very simple EEG devices to measure depth of anesthesia. Rather than having streams of EEG data, they make these devices. The BIS is one of them, the SedLine is another, that simple electrodes across the front of the forehead. It goes into a box and it gives you an idiot number from 0 to 100. And the patient awake is between 80 to 100. They say if you keep the patient under anesthesia between 40 and 60, they won't wake up, they won't be aware, they won't soothe you, basically. But it's also used sometimes in the ICU to measure brain death and brain damage and so forth, in which case it will be down around the 20s. So we do things like cardiac donation, taking organs after cardiac death. Now there's 2 ways for organ transplants. The patient is declared brain dead, we take them to the OR, they can have an anesthetic. If they're not brain dead, but they're hopeless, they're terminal, they're in agony, the patient the family agrees, they do what's called donation after cardiac death, where they take them to right near the operating room, they turn off the ventilator, they stop the drips, and the heart rate slows down, the patient eventually dies. And they were using these brain monitors to see when they wanted to see that this went to 0, but they were amazed, shocked in fact, and this was actually originally done by Dr. Lakshmi Chawla at George Washington University. At the time of death, they get this burst of activity, back into the awake range. And when they looked at the actual raw data, this is gamma synchrony EEG. This would be awake by any other criteria. This is high frequency gamma, and I forget if it was Pim or everyone was saying, well, they say it's random firings, but it can't be random firings because it's perfectly coherent across both hemispheres, and that just doesn't make sense to call it random. And the people who make this, actually the other machine, the SedLine, they use it in the ICU a lot, and I've talked to their reps about it, and people started using it in the ICU when patients expired. And they saw this burst of activity that lasts anywhere from 90 seconds to many minutes in about 90% of patients who died in the ICU. And it got to be a thing where they would tell them what they were doing, and then they stopped doing it in some cases because the 10% who didn't have it, the family was all depressed. So they thought that's not quite fair. But as far as I know, nobody's really written this up. I tried to get them to do a study, and nobody really wanted to do it. There's a lot of implications on it. But this end-of-life brain activity, it also occurs in animals. We had a paper at the Tucson conference last year about this in rats. And they did it more scientifically where they stopped the heart immediately and with lethal injection of potassium. And there was this burst of activity very much like this in the rats. And we're going to probably have more about that. So end-of-life brain activity. And this could be, we don't know for sure, but it could be that if this patient will revive, they'd come back and say, yeah, I saw the white light, I talked to my dead relatives, sense of calm. We don't really know because these patients died, but this could be the signature of the NDE, or the soul, if you will, leaving the body. We don't know, but I can tell you it's not random firings because you wouldn't get gamma synchrony out of it. So, let me mention one more thing and then I'll close. If consciousness is coming from these vibrations, can we influence it in any way? And through brain stimulation techniques, for example. So how would we do that? Well, there's a number of non-invasive brain stimulation techniques: transcranial magnetic stimulation, transcranial electrical stimulation. This is kind of fading out. This is very expensive and it's unclear exactly what it does. Another one is ultrasound. As you know, ultrasound is used in imaging and has been used for 80 or 90 years. And we see babies in the uterus. It doesn't seem to be harmful. It's used to image baby brains in newborns to look for strokes and bleeds. And when I discovered megahertz, and ultrasound is megahertz. So when I found out microtubules have megahertz vibrations, anyway, when I learned, I looked up to see if anybody had put ultrasound into the brain, and a guy at Arizona State University had been doing it in animals, but he hadn't done it in humans yet. And he showed behavioral effects and electrophysiological effects in animals. I said to my colleagues in anesthesia, we have chronic pain patients who are depressed. We should try giving them ultrasound in the brain and see if they feel better. And they said to me, well, we don't try anything on any patient until we try it on ourselves first. This is your crazy idea. You got a shaved head. You go first. The guy at Arizona State had started a company making these ultrasound devices that people would wear, and they're very stylish, as you can see. And he made this ultrasound headset. I think is the name of his company. And you can see that if you put these on, you're immediately sexy and beautiful. And you also raise a lot of money. But anyway, on a dare, I tried it, and I did it myself and had my friend do it. And here's my brain on ultrasound. This is my skull, this is my brain. And when I tried it myself, I put it to my head, I didn't feel anything, and I put it down, I was a little disappointed. But about a minute later, I got a buzz, and I felt really, really good for about an hour. So I said, we should try this. So on our patients, which we did. And in 2013, we published the first study of transcranial ultrasound, transcranial across the skull, on mental states in the Journal of Brain Stimulation. We showed that 15 seconds of right frontotemporal TUS, transcranial ultrasound, subthermal. We don't want to cook or heat the brain. Very low intensity. It's very safe. We've done it in 300 people now. Resulted in at least 40 minutes of increased mood as measured by visual analog scale. So the next thing, we continue to do that, and then a year ago, this paper came out, showed that ultrasound helps in Alzheimer's disease in animals, which is not that surprising because it stabilizes microtubules, which you know that it does. And so we started several months ago a study on ultrasound for Alzheimer's patients and traumatic brain injury. And that's going forward, and we'll keep you posted on that. So let me conclude with the following statements, conclusions. First is that consciousness consists of resonant vibrations at various scales. You can think of them as lokas or astral planes in the structure of the universe, space-time geometry, more like music than computation. Conscious perceptions and choices may be influenced by or resonate with platonic values, the Akashic record, way of the Tao, knows, Jungian collective unconscious, embedded in space-time geometry. And I want to differ with several things that have been said at this conference, and I say this, I'm not a physicist, but I follow what Roger says, and he says there's no need to go outside space and time, there's no need for extra dimensions, extra universes. What we need are different scales. So remember I showed you the different scales in space-time geometry. They can give you what you need, or what we've been talking about here. All the mystery, you don't need extra dimensions. You can come from deeper levels of the universe. And in fact, as the Beatles sang, the deeper you go, the higher you fly, the deeper you go. As you go into the structure of the universe, consciousness becomes more intense. Consciousness is intrinsic to the universe. End-of-life brain activity and EEG may correlate with near-death out-of-body experiences and perhaps the quantum soul leaving the body. And consciousness may, at least in principle, exist independent of biology. I think any of the critics who criticize the people who have spoken here, you need to turn around and say, explain consciousness in the brain before you can exclude consciousness out of the brain. Right now, nobody can explain, except maybe Roger, consciousness out of, in the brain. It's all a big bunch of hand-waving bullshit. Pardon my language. And finally, tuning the brain with transcranial ultrasound may treat Alzheimer's brain injury and induce altered states. Thank you very much.